Dr. Ocay finished his master's degree from, or got his master's degree from the University of San Carlos at Cebu City. And then he went on to finish his doctoral degree in philosophy in Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Recently, he had a stint at the Frankfurt School. You know, he is definitely a legit academic doing critical theory. Without further ado, let me give you Dr. Jeffry Ocay.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. Before I proceed to my talk, I just want to say a few things on critical theory, some of the key concepts in critical theory that we need to know before we do some critical theory. Critical theory starts with the analysis, again, as I've said yesterday in the open forum. It always starts with the analysis of a pathological society. So critical theories always identify some pathologies in the society and then point some alternatives or identify some alternatives in which we can offer in which the idea of emancipation is based. And so, if I know many of you know already what critical theory is, but some of the few things that we need to remember is that critical theories aim for the realization of a more humane and just society, or during the time of Marx, the classless or let's say utopian society. Now, the realization of a more humane and just society, to use Marcus's words or jargon, requires political agents. And so, because these political agents are the ones who are going to now oppose or resist those forms of domination. So emancipation requires opposition, resistance, refusal from the dominated, but the oppressed or the dominated cannot say oppose the repressive system if he is not politicized. And in addition to that, individuals cannot be politicized or cannot become agents of social transformation, or they cannot be politicized if they do not have some kind of consciousness about what's going on around. And so that is why in Lukács and many, in all of the critical theories, social transformation begins with the awareness of the individual or the victims of injustice. And that's precisely what Foucault did, in his works, do some narrative or a genealogy of the way in which the individuals in society have been formed and transformed and produced by the apparatuses of power, inherent in the society. And so in my paper, I will be identifying, especially the Philippines as the margin, those agents of social transformation, or the politicized being in the Philippine society. And as you know, the title of my paper is The Peasant Movement in the Philippines, the Peasant Movement and Great Refusal in the Philippines, situating critical theory at the margins. The paper actually is an expansion of Herbert Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal. And so I will be appropriating Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal in the Philippines, but we have to take note that I'm not going to pay lip service to Marcuse. I will critique Marcuse as well at the end of the day. So this paper picks up on a dimension of Herbert Marcuse's model of critical theory that is greatly underdeveloped, and so much so that, particularly in the light of post-colonial theory, it is almost an embarrassment that what I refer to at the margins, or as the margin, that is the semi-colonial periphery, that is economically exploited, politically dominated, and culturally hegemonized by imperialism or by imperialist powers, did not have a more important place in Marcuse's own work. And so there was a great refusal in Marcuse, but it was only applied in the first world country. That is why in the one-dimensional man, we see his critique of the society, we see that his critique of the society is based or focused primarily on the West, the United States, particularly. So we do not find in Marcuse the appropriation or the application of the concept of the Great Refusal in the societies at the margins. And so my take here is, as I will show later, when the Great Refusal, or Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal, is brought to the periphery, it has to take on different form or a new form. And so it has to change because the context has changed. And has not been, that concept, has not been far more the focus of Douglas Kilmer, one of the leading Marcusian and critical theorists today, and other who had fastened on to the Marxist Marcuse. In fact, Marcuse made only scattered statements about the nature of struggles in the society at the margins of the global system. And so it's not a sustained, you talk about Vietnam, you talk about the New Left, but those statements were simply, were scattered statements in his, oeuvre, in his works. So it's, we cannot find a sustained discussion of the Great Refusal applied in the periphery, in Marcuse's works. And when he did reference the plight of the marginalized, and when he did reference their plight and potential, he did not develop clearly how this theory could help in analyzing this context. Thus, my paper will look into the possibility of making Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal relevant in the Philippines today, in an attempt to signal the possibility of redemptive alternatives to the struggle for emancipation. The fundamental question of the paper is how Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal, which is understood both as a rupture in history or a rupture in capitalist society, and as a form of critical thought that can reject the prevailing repressive rationality, can be concretely articulated in the Philippines. I argue that the Great Refusal at the margins cannot depend on an established democracy, but must contend with political violence. My take here is, if we analyze the way in which the indigenous peoples, for example, in Mindanao, have been compounded or have been marginalized by agents of globalization, agents of capitalism, we cannot talk about the hibernation, notion of dialogue based on democracy. Sometimes we have to contend with political violence in that place. Because in the first place, for example, it's difficult to sit down and listen together with the miners or the companies in Mindanao. And so in the first place, these companies will not listen to the cause of the indigenous peoples. And so sometimes there is a need, a whole notion of recognition has to take new form in this case. And so this struggle is not all about my contribution in the society or the workplace, but the recognition of my rights towards, let's say, ancestral domain and the right to live. If we understand that in the context of militarization in the Philippines or in Mindanao. I argue further that the new left model advocated by Marcuse in the 1970s is, however, potentially viable because the cultural focus of the new left style politics confronts an alien hegemonic culture at the margins, rather than an autochthonous culture of capitalist consumption. In doing so, I will present a compelling case of Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal based on my reinterpretation of critical theory in the neo-colonial context. The Philippines, as we know, have been facing enormous social problems and injustices like abject poverty, massive unemployment, militarization, extrajudicial killings as we experience today, and all kinds of human rights violations. These problems have been compounded and entrenched by the invasion of the country by capitalist forces, relayed and aided by the local elites and politicians, and that's what's happening actually in the Philippines. The domination that we experience in the Philippines have been compounded and entrenched by agents of transnational corporations, for example. And so the experience of injustice in the Philippines is double: technological domination and the primitive form of domination like militarization in the periphery. Hence, in a country at the margins like the Philippines, the domination that accompanies a capitalist order has actually been two-sided. By contrast with the domination Marcuse analyzed in his famous post-war writings, that is, the modern technological form of domination has indeed applied to the Filipino populations, leading to a form of one-dimensionality, particularly to the Philippine society. But it has also been accompanied by more direct, brutal, and primitive forms of oppression to impose a foreign rule and its spirit onto the native population. In the face of such enormous power of domination, combining the cultural, psychological, and intellectual sophistication of technological domination with the naked brutality of what Marx called primitive accumulation, in Marx, what changes are there that a society like the Philippines could harbor anything like a sign of the Great Refusal? In fact, I will try to show that it is the most oppressed of the oppressed that offers precisely a hope of this kind. And so my ultimate aim in this paper, therefore, is to show that the Filipino peasants and their plight, but also in their organization and indeed in their struggles, points to a way of life that escapes the apparently inescapable logic of capitalism. To that extent, at least, they thus point to the possibility of emancipation. However, contrary to Marcuse's contention that in late capitalist society or societies, every form of oppression has been dissolved and became part of the status quo, that's one of the main theses in Marcuse. In a highly advanced society, there is no longer opposition. Everyone is already hooked up in the capitalist system, and so opposition is impossible. My take is, in the periphery, in the margins, we still have ages of social transformation. That not all of us are dissolved or hooked up in the present system. And so I will argue that the peasant movement in the Philippines provide substantive evidence to show that class antagonism in the consciousness of it are still a reality in the Philippines. And that Filipino critical consciousness, which climaxed in the 1896 revolution, has survived and is on the rise again, despite experiencing important setbacks during the Spanish American and Japanese period. In the next, by the way, the paper is divided into two parts. The next discussion would be a rehashing or an engagement on Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal, and the second part is the relevance of the Great Refusal in the Philippines. And so the next part is on the Great Refusal. I will briefly discuss the Great Refusal before I appropriate it in the Philippine society. And so the Great Refusal in a nutshell. What is Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal? Let me begin with a brief discussion on Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal before I fully articulate the specificity of this concept as it is applied in the Philippines, in the Philippine context, especially the way in which it is embodied by the Filipino peasants. Marcuse understands the Great Refusal as a kind of negativity, Hegelian notion of negativity, both in thoughts and action, which enables the individuals to transform their present needs, sensibility, consciousness, values, and behavior into a new radical sensibility. A sensibility that does not tolerate injustice and which resists and opposes all forms of control and domination. Douglas Kerner shows that for Marcuse, the Great Refusal is also a political refusal and revolt against the system of domination and oppression exacted by the capitalist society. The Great Refusal for Marcuse, therefore, is both individual and collective refusal. So it could be individual and collective refusal aimed at transforming the system of domination and oppression and the realization of a radical social change, the realization of what Marcuse calls non-repressive and free society. Firstly, it is collective in as much as it can only be realized if it takes the shape of a social movement. But it is also individual in as much as it requires the transformation of the individual's patterns of thoughts and affectivity. And so, as I said in the introductory parts, transformation or social transformation, which is a toned down term for revolution, can only be realized or starts with the consciousness of the individual. And that is why the New People's Army, for example, in the Philippines, go to the mountains and educates the masses there, because a transformation or a resistance or a refusal to the system requires, a transformation of the consciousness of the individual, including their affectivity or their affect. In One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse maintains that it is only the great refusal that expresses a truly revolutionary mode of opposition. It is important to note that the great refusal is not simply an act of refusal for refusal's sake. Teresa tells us here. As is clear, the great refusal is above all a struggle for and towards emancipation. It is a struggle towards the realization of a non-repressive, free, more humane, and just society, where people can be freed from all forms of social control and domination. The great refusal is thus a call for social transformation, which is necessary in the sense that liberation requires a rupture in history. And we know that in Hegel and Marx, any forms of transformation, any talk of emancipation necessitates the idea of a rupture in history. And we know that in Hegel, if you're familiar with Hegel's dialectic, the transformation of being requires its own self-contradiction. And becoming, which is understood in critical theory as emancipation in Marcuse, for example, necessarily implies the destruction of the old system and be replaced by a new one. In the same, the great refusal is thus a call for social transformation, which is necessary in the sense that liberation requires a rupture in history, and this rupture can only be performed through radical action. So there is no rupture without a conscious radical action on the part of the political agents. In some passages of repressive tolerance, Marcuse fully endorses the possibility that this radical action is sometimes violent, because whether you like it or not, violence is always there. I'm not endorsing violence, but Hegel, Marx are correct. Now, for example, Marx said the history of the world is nothing but the history of conflicts between and among classes in the society. And any talk of, again, a free society entails the overthrowing of the repressive class. And so, I quote Marcuse. Marcuse writes, and I quote, "If they, the oppressed and the overpowered minorities, use violence, they do not start a new chain of violence, but try to break an established one." So there is already an established violence out there, and so the reaction of the agents of social transformation simply break that kind of that established violence. Since they will be punished, they know the risk, and when they are willing to take it, no third person, including the intellectuals here, and at least of all the educators and intellectuals, has the right to preach them abstention. With all the qualifications of the hypothesis based on an open historical record, it seems that the violence emanating from the rebellion of the oppressed or the oppressed classes broke the historical continuum of injustice, cruelty, and silence for a brief moment, like what happened in Ed's revolution in 1986. But brief but explosive enough to achieve an increase in the scope of freedom and injustice, and a better and more equitable distribution of misery and oppression in a social system. In one word, violence brings progress in civilization. At that time. If you talk about, for example, and so on, many Filipinos have become jaded, or many Filipinos do not find that revolution meaningful anymore, because after they overthrew Marcos, the same thing happened, the same oppression exists. But my argument there is, look, at least in that struggle we were able to overthrow the dictator and restore democracy in the country. And so at least in the perspective, we see some kind of progress, at least in the Philippine society. And so in these passages, historical violence at the hands of the oppressed is justified in terms of the Kantian paradigm to which the Marxian element of class struggle has been added. The kind of revolution Marcuse envisions there is in fact different from what we have witnessed in history. For example, the French Revolution. Because these violent upheavals were still premised on social conditions in which scarcity continued to prevail. And so the kind of refusal that I'm talking here, or that Marcuse is talking about, it's not the same with the refusal that we witness in history, like the Bolshevik Revolution. Although Marcuse said we cannot do away with violence, but that is not the kind of social transformation that he is thinking during this time. Because Marcuse was addressing technological domination. And so the form of domination in highly advanced society or societies is exacted or in a subtle way. And so Marcuse is no longer addressing militarization and extrajudicial killings, but he was talking about the kind of domination that is subtly applied in us, in one word, cultural form of oppression. And so they fought for essential rights and signaled the lack of fulfillments for the majority within the capitalist order, but they could not yet point to the full and proper transformation of the system. I'm referring to the French Revolution and other violent forms of resistance. A more appropriate image of social transformation than the one to be gained from these previous struggles is the image of social transformation entailed in the concept of new sensibility in the Marcuse. According to Marcuse, this kind of revolution is driven by the vital need to be free from the administered comforts and the destructive productivity of the exploitative society. Freed from smooth heteronomy, a revolution which, by virtue of this biological foundation, would have a chance of turning quantitative technical progress into qualitatively different ways of life, precisely because it would be a revolution occurring at a high level of material and intellectual development. So it's not, I will explain this later, of course, but this kind of revolution, again, it's not the same with the Bolshevik and the French Revolution and the Long March in China. In Counter-Revolution and Revolt, Marcuse argues that this revolution involves the new sensibility, that is the transformation of the cultural and material basis of the society, the needs and aspirations of the individuals and their consciousness and sensibility. And this new sensibility, as I will explain later, is revolutionary because it militates against technological domination, it militates against the numbing effects of the functional language of the consumerist society, and at the same time shatters the kind of false consciousness that this language engenders. With this novel form of revolution, the Marxist notion of proletariat as the sole agent of radical change has been significantly revised. And so my argument as well is the proletarians in the Philippines could be an agent of social transformation, but at the end of the day, the most potent agents of social transformation are found in the periphery. Despite the fact that Marcuse saw that violence is sometimes ineluctable, he made it very clear that in highly advanced society, or in a highly advanced society, this tactic should not be employed. A struggle which attempts to seize power directly from the center or centers of political control, Marcuse says, should not be resorted to because in the advanced industrial society, the military and police power have been so organized in the hands of an effectively functioning government. And so it's impossible to talk about a bloody revolution in the United States, the FBI, the CIA, and all the agencies are functioning well, and so they could easily quell any resistance or any armed struggle there. But in the societies of the margins like the Philippines, it's still, possible. More importantly, such tactics surely would not draw support from the working class, due primarily to the prevalence of reformist consciousness among them. And so we also found some reformists within the left today. And so it's very hard to convince people at the center of the Philippine society, like the intellectuals in Manila, to convince, it's impossible or difficult to convince them to join, the struggle for emancipation that entails the overthrowing of the system. Because look, their consciousness is already hooked up in the system. Marcuse assumes that he is talking about societies at the center of the system. But what about the societies at the margins, like the Philippines? Here, his famous concept of the new left and his notion of radical sensibility take on new meanings. As I will show later, at the margins, the system uses a combination of technological domination and direct violence. In the Philippines at least. In the United States, in Germany, you don't find primitive forms of domination there, like militarization. But in the Philippines, again, that's a reality. The imposition of an alien way of life made to suit colonial powers and direct imposition of unfair economic treaties and political and military agreements. In this case, the Great Refusal takes on a different shape. First of all, the question of violence is different from what it is in countries at the center of the global spectrum. In countries at the margins, there was the problem of armed power, of army and police, and transnational corporations. Again, these three are still a reality in the Philippines. Agents of globalization already penetrated societies in Mindanao through mining, logging, and all stuff for that matter. Thus, the struggle against colonialism at the margins was a violent one. Second, the model of the new left, an old model now defunct in the West, also takes on different form at the margins. For Marcuse, the new left is not a single organization with the same ethos like the Communist Party of the Philippines or the National Liberation Fronts in general. Rather, it refers to the different minority groups, like the students' movements, women's movements, labor unions, peasant movements, and other politically inclined groups that struggle for liberation. For Marcuse, these forces are the concrete expressions of the Great Refusal because they define the limits of the established society and signal the impending rupture of history. The new left for Marcuse is the only possible counter-force in the advanced industrial society. And must assume that the vast task of political education, dispelling the false and mutilated consciousness of the people so that they themselves experience their condition and their ambitions as vital needs and apprehend the ways and the means for their liberation. Thus, for Marcuse, as Marcuse argues, the revolution driven by the new sensibility must be brought to the political arena. This is now what Marcuse suggests in order to materialize emancipation, that is, refuse, resist, and repel all forms of social control and domination. We want liberation. This program will mean something different and perhaps easier to implement in countries at the margins like the Philippines because it is easier to reject alien way of life and return to original culture and question of language. A return to indigenous mode of work, consumption habit, and distribution, which primarily hinges on the notion of cooperation, exemplified by the Baranganic society of the pre-Hispanic Philippines, can also be viewed as the best alternative because it would mean a redirection of the capitalist mode of production towards the satisfaction of the senses and imagination of the individuals. According to Marcuse, this would weaken the establishment and eventually lead to the demise of the capitalist system. So much for the Great Refusal. Let me now proceed to the second part of my paper, that is the Peasant Movement and the Great Refusal in the Philippines. But why the Great Refusal? But why the Peasant Movement, despite the fact that there are a great number of active social and political movements in the Philippines today, such as the student movements and the women's movements and the labor unions, that also struggled and continue to struggle against American-led capitalism. The privilege of any such movements located at the margins of the system is that as soon as their particular struggle links the specific demands that they make and the specific forms of injustice that they denounce to neo-colonial policies and imperialist domination premised on capitalistic logic, they immediately point to a possible outside of the system. First, they highlight those who are in the periphery because they are outside of the system. They highlight from the outside the real violence and destructive potential of the system. A violence and destructive potential that has become invisible at the center. And second, they also embody other ways of living and organizing society. But this view from the outside is precisely what Marcuse calls or envisioned the Great Refusal should achieve, both in critical and pragmatic terms. At the center, as Marcuse argues, only art for him was able to maintain the possibility of resistance. And that is why we find in Eros and Civilization in one-dimensional man the argument that for Marcuse, art is the ultimate form of the Great Refusal. But at least in highly industrial societies, the United States, Australia, Germany, the rest of Europe, of course art is the ultimate form of refusal. But again, if we bring critical theory to the margins of the Philippines, it's impossible to talk about art here kasi gutom pa yung marami sa atin. In countries at the margins like the Philippines, by contrast, many radical movements embody this possibility much more explicitly and concretely. If we recall, an important implication of Marcuse's model was that the truth and the freedom of negative thinking of the Great Refusal have their ground and reason in those movements that stay outside of the established capitalist system. This means that exception from and resistance to capitalist domination comes from those who are not completely contained within the system, yet receive the harshest exploitation, like the indigenous peoples in Mindanao. The student movements, for example, the National Union of Students in the Philippines, have joined for a long time force in resisting the onslaught of imperialism against Philippine education. The women's movements also, like Gabriela and many others, struggled not only against domestic violence and other forms of injustice committed against women, but also against capitalist exploitation in the country. So it's the women's movements today do not only struggle for the recognition of the rights as wives, but these groups also fought for or fight for, capitalist domination or imperialism or neo-colonialism. Much as the labor unions, such as the Kilusang Mayuno, fight for the rights of the workers, like better working conditions and just pay, but it is also one of the staunchest critiques of U.S. imperialism. Indeed, as these movements clearly fight not only for the classical goal of justice and equality, but also for national liberation. There is no doubt, therefore, that these movements are also expressions of what Marcuse calls the Great Refusal. Amongst all the movements listed above, however, one in particular appears to me to be the most imminent, if unlikely, embodiments of the Great Refusal, at least in its spirit, namely the Peasant Movement. My emphasis on the Peasant Movement is founded, first of all, on the fact that they are probably the most brutalized of Filipino populations to have suffered from direct or indirect capitalist exploitation, whether imposed through the colonial powers or not. The full impact of trade liberalization that started with the Payne-Aldrich Act in 1909 hits the peasants the deepest and marginalized them severely. For sure, although it is true that elements of the discourse and actions of the student movements, the women's movements, and the labor unions can be considered as expressions of the Great Refusal, in a country like the Philippines, it is in fact the peasant movements that embodies the most potent critique of and resistance to capitalist domination. But that dimension is of course by far not sufficient to support my claim that the peasant organizations and struggles incarnate the basic principles of what is required that would lead to something like a great refusal. The force of the peasant movement also lies in their number, and most importantly, in their alliance with peasant movements in other countries at the margins. As Walden Bellew argues, the international movement of small farmers and peasants has been one of the most dynamic sources of resistance against capitalistic domination in recent years. Against the false hope of neoliberal propaganda, if a country like the Philippines is to experience real emancipation, it will have to touch real masses in ways that are real for them. Rather than the false hopes attached to the inclusion into industrial consumer society, an alternative, more and just flourishing society would have to be found in the very structure of peasant life. And thirdly, as a matter of fact, in the past history of the Philippines, it is the peasant masses that had been the most potent agents of resistance to domination. Here, the masses of peasant population become another argument. They represent a serious political force. History shows that the Filipino peasants have always played a crucial role in the fight against colonialism. During the Spanish period, as we know it, most if not all of the more than 200 revolts against the Spanish regime were waged by the peasants themselves. The one led by Diggle Silang is a classic example. Even the 1896 revolution was primarily composed of peasants, despite the fact that it was founded by the proletarian Andres Bonifacio. During the American period, still, the forces that struggled for liberation were predominantly peasants. The Ocay revolts, as we know, the last group that fought against the Americans during the Filipino-American War, was very much dependent on the peasantry. The Hook that valiantly fought the Japanese during the Second World War and then against the Americans during the post-war period were mostly peasants from Central Luzon. And today, the New People's Army, the NPA, the fiercest group that fights against imperialism, and bureaucrat capitalism and feudalism, is basically peasant by composition. Although the peasant movement in the Philippines began as a struggle for just landlord-tenant relations, reasonable land rents and land ownership, in the wake of capitalism, vis-a-vis the establishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines, it has explicitly become an anti-capitalist movement. In the course of history, the Filipino peasants were able to relate the struggle against land to the struggle against colonialism, and now the struggle against American-led capitalism. For example, today, issues of sovereignty such as unjust trade relations and foreign military bases agreement have been articulated mostly by the peasants themselves, or by movements that draw strength from the peasants. To show that the peasants' struggle for land became an anti-capitalist movement, as well as how the peasants were excluded in the capitalist system, thus excluding them from what Marcuse calls one-dimensional society, I will discuss briefly the way in which American-led capitalism in the Philippines have impoverished the peasants and made them more and more landless, thereby causing the crystallization of the latter's resentment to a point when they could begin to embody the principles of the Great Refusal. It must be remembered that when the United States decided to annex the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, there was already a group of landed Filipino elites that dominated the Philippine society, or Philippine politics. These landed elites had already benefited from the exports of agricultural products during the second half of the 19th century, because the Americans were fully aware that the Filipino revolutionaries, especially the peasants, continued to resist American colonial governments, and because they knew that the peasants posed a threat to the local elite, the Americans had to form an alliance with these local elites. To do this, the Americans continued the Spanish policy on the export of agricultural products, thus reinforcing the position of the landed elite. For the rest of the 20th century, the strong alliance between the Americans and the Filipino landed elite, which later helped form what is now known as the patron-client relationship, have left a deep imprint on the economic and political landscape of the Philippines, and we can still, feel it today. As James Potzel, a renowned scholar on agrarian reform in the Philippines, writes, the U.S. built upon the economic and political legacy of Spanish rule, shaping both the economic and state structure that would characterize the Philippines for the rest of the 20th century. Let me bypass or skip a few pages because there are simply articulations of the way in which the peasant movements or the peasants have been marginalized by capitalism. Let me proceed to So what the discussion shows is that the peasant populations have been the direct victims of capitalist domination as it has developed in the Philippines. They are the largest and most exploited of all social classes in the country. And to begin with, it is precisely in that respect that they can represent a force that corresponds to what Marcuse envisions or calls the Great Refusal. As the direct victims of the neo-colonial exploitation that accompanies real existing capitalism at the margins, they are in no way included in the logic of a system as other populations are. But the great force of the peasants movement is also its sheer number, and indeed, as I will try to show, the alternative non-consumerist way of life it can propose. I will now present my argument based on, of course, my engagement with Marcuse, why the peasant movement can be an alternative to domination in the Philippines. Let me just briefly discuss my argument. Again, the kind of revolution that Marcuse endorses that I also would like to articulate or share appropriate in the Philippines is not a violent revolution, but a revolution against consumerism. The situation is this: in highly, or let's say at the center, domination is precisely technological, and so it is a cultural form of domination. According to Marcuse, the domination involves the manipulation of the taste buds, the affectivity of the individual. Like, for example, controlling the taste buds of the kids. So in this case, domination is cultural in nature. It's already a subtle form of domination. There is no militarization in it. And so if for Marcuse, if the form of domination in highly industrial societies or at the center is cultural, then resistance is also cultural by nature. And so as much as possible it has to avoid violent forms of refusals. And so according to Marcuse, it is appropriate if we articulate the work attitude and consumption habits of those who are at the margins as a form of, resistance. And so, in the last few pages of my paper, I will be talking about the consumption habits and work attitude of the peasant movement as a potent form of resistance, resistance against domination. And so, let me talk about cooperative work and the consumption habit of the Filipino peasants. This cooperative form of work is an effective alternative to capitalist-oriented type of work because it unites or it unties the peasants from surplus repression demanded of them by the capitalist society and frees them from the obligation of minimum individual performance. More importantly, such cooperative form of work enables the Filipino peasants to come up with a viable economic organization that allows them to control the marketing of their products. They do this by establishing consumer and credit cooperatives at the village and community levels. In principle, this strategy, an alternative strategy of producing and consuming basic commodities that is both antithetical to capitalist oriented type of production process, and yet ensure satisfaction of their vital needs, should spare the peasants from being crushed by imported products, such as imported rice, and from being swallowed by large-scale agribusiness as happened elsewhere in the country. In other words, this indigenous alternative of producing and consuming protects these Filipino peasants from the aggressive and destructive tendencies of technological development, which, according to Marcuse, perpetuates servitude amidst growing possibilities of freedom and which deepens poverty amidst abundance. Furthermore, their distance from the city centers combines with their social organization itself, involving around an alternative, a cooperative model of work, keeps them from being transformed into insatiable consumers, whose consciousness is reduced into mere biological impulses that merely adjust to the technical processes of production. Following Marcuse, I would claim that this attitude to work, or toward work, which is antithetical to the capitalist work ethic, and the consumption habits that go with it, constitute a sphere that is not completely integrated into the capitalist system. As a result, through its sheer existence and its relative success, it demonstrates the possibility of escaping a repressive society, but develops only on the condition of accelerating waste, plant obsolescence, destruction, and exploitation of large populations. In the face of the tremendous power of modern industry, science, and financial techniques, the appeal to indigenous modes of social organization and cooperative work might appear incredibly naive for many of us. But this is only so if one forgets the immensely destructive nature of contemporary technological rationality, a potential for destruction which drove Marcuse to seek for the possibilities for alternatives. To speak very simply, and if one lets oneself be guided by Marcuse's analysis, if the logic at work at the center, which has been imported to the new emerging powers like the Philippines, and which has subjugated countries at the margins, is left to rule unchecked, only a catastrophe can emerge from it. Either social, for example, new wars, or environmental, for example, climate change, or a combination of the two. Against this catastrophic background, the alternative model of social life presented by the Baranganic system, and indeed the historical struggles that were waged in its name, suddenly appear anything but sentimental. However, it is very important to say that the emphasis on a traditional Filipino way of living and working together does not amount to a form of regression. That is to say, a return to a traditional form of production process where labor was still considered long and hard due to the absence of a more sophisticated technology. It does not imply regression. It implies the, not romanticizing, but the promotion, highlighting of the consumption habit and attitude of the indigenous peoples that could potentially reverse the capitalist way of producing and consuming. As a matter of fact, Marcuse was not opposed to all forms of technology when he denounced technological domination. The point to make is that the development of technology should be guided by the traditional attitude of the peasants toward work and consumption, so that it would serve to disburden their toil and satisfy their vital needs. In this new type of production relations where technology takes central role, the people produce enough for the local economy and the family. There might be surplus, but only in the sense of excess goods normally used for consumption. And that is not one that is not solely intended for circulation as exchange value or surplus intended for profit. The type of society that emerges from this kind of socio-economic relations shows the basis of what Marcuse envisions as a good society. For Marcuse, according to Peter Linz, the good society is a social order which is primarily based on cooperative form of labor necessary for the realization of freedom. Lind notes that this society allows a new homo faber, or the new individual with a new sensibility, according to Marcuse, to devote himself fully into his share of the collective social labor, to take full part in decisions to produce this or that object and participate on equal basis in the allocation of communal tasks. Indeed, the peasant way of life provides a concrete example of such communal form of life, organized around cooperative work. This Filipino peasants also points to something like a sign of the Great Refusal in the way in which they approach land distribution, as shown in the Philippines government, or as I have shown lately, the Philippine government failed to implement true and effective land reform. This prompted the Filipino peasants to promote a radical and indigenous alternative of implementing land distribution that goes beyond the confines of the modern law. They do this in the form of land occupation, a process of collectively occupying idle lands and making them productive. Although the Filipino peasants were eventually unsuccessful in their struggle for land ownership by way of land occupation, what is important is that these actions break the familiar with the routine ways of seeing and understanding reality. Theirs is a kind of struggle that differs from the traditional political opposition borrowed from the West. These efforts have allowed the peasants to challenge the state and the local capitalists in a unique sense, which in fact corresponds to the kind of politics Marcuse envisioned, a politics that would step outside the mechanisms of reproduction of the system. For Marcuse, it is only through the methodological disengagement from and refusal of the established order, through an opposition from the outside, that a rupture in history can be signaled. One specific example is particularly telling in my mind to highlight the novelty and effectiveness of farmers' struggle in resisting the established society and the concomitant system of domination. This is the example of the Higaonon tribe farmers, I think you're familiar with it, from Sumila, Bukidnon, and how they fought for land rights recognition. Their land of about 355 acres was grabbed by converting it into a hog farm by San Miguel Foods Incorporated. The Higaonon tribe farmers, as we know, petitioned the departments of agrarian reform to issue a cease and desist order, but the Supreme Courts of the Philippines dismissed their case because they lacked legal standing. Yet the Higaonon tribe farmers decided to continue fighting for their ancestral land through extra legal means. Thus, on October 10, 2007, the 55 Higaonon tribe farmers started to march the 1,055 miles long Sumila Bukidnon to Manila highway for 2 months, arriving in Manila on 3 December 2007. When they reached Manila, they staged a hunger strike for several days in front of Malacanang. On December 17, 2007, President Arroyo, the former President Arroyo, revoked the conversion order on the disputed land in Sumila, Bukidnon, resulting in the return of the land to the 55 members of the Higaonon tribe farmers. The success of the Higaonon tribe farmers is indeed an exceptional case in the history of the struggle for land rights recognition in less developed countries, and perhaps in the first world countries. It is because this struggle defies the reign of law, yet receives due recognition by the law itself. This is what Marcuse would want to see in those subjects who struggle for radical social change. Now to my conclusion. The foregoing is not certainly a full explication of the ways in which the Filipino peasants express the Great Refusal. Yet the illustrations above, albeit brief, suggest that Despite the overwhelming force of technological domination and other forms of social control and domination, there remain in the Philippine society forces that carry the hope of emancipation. And in my paper, I argue that that's the peasants themselves. Their attitude towards work and their consumption habit, which continue to be informed by the cooperative values of the pre-colonial and pre-capitalist society, show that they are capable of demonstrating liberating tendencies within the established technological society. That is to say, if they were given the chance to own the land they till, to control the means of production, and to determine their own needs within the existing conditions of unbridled technological advancement, these people would be able to propound a valid alternative model of development opposed to what Marcuse calls repressive technological society. Of course, as Marcuse gestured towards the end of his seminal work, One-Dimensional Man, the chance of this alternative is almost bereft of hope. The road to liberation, if it is attainable at all, is surely an arduous one. What this implies for the Filipino peasants is that no matter how hard they struggle for land rights recognition, or for reasonable land rents, or for liberation in general, success is far from guaranteed. Yet, they have to continue the struggle, which appears to be the last remaining one in a society that becomes more and more one-dimensional. In the end, the Filipino peasants are burdened with the task of waging a perpetual opposition to the repressive technological society. As Marcuse writes, and I quote, "We must always resist if we still want to live as human beings and to work and be happy." Thank you so much.